Welcome to the very first episode of Strategy Geek, a podcast where we examine topics in business, technology, and entrepreneurial strategy through a lens enlightened by the lessons of the humanities. We try to do this in a fun and conversational way with subject matter experts who not only know their professional business, but also a thing or two about telling a good story. Have you ever heard the phrase, "loose lips sink ships"? Its origins date back to the Second World War, with the United States facing the German U-boat menace in the Atlantic and an aggressive Japanese Navy in the Pacific. The government and military were rightly concerned about Axis spies obtaining critical troop and material shipment information. Propaganda posters featured grim images of ships sinking into the sea and lonely puppies mourning the loss of their masters. Loose lips do indeed sink ships. The United Kingdom had its own slogan, slightly more direct perhaps, as a nation that had been at war far longer than America: "Careless talk costs lives." The message was clear. Every soldier and citizen was responsible for controlling the information they shared with loved ones, colleagues, and friends in both letters and public talk. American servicemen and women were actually given a list of 10 prohibited subjects. Here are just a few examples. Number 1, don't write military information of Army units, their location, strength, materiel, or equipment. Number 5, don't disclose movements of ships, naval or merchant, troops or aircraft. Number 7, don't write about the effect of enemy operations. Now, all of this may seem awfully obvious to a modern listener with the benefit of hindsight. They were at war, after all. But think about how unnatural this must have been for the hundreds of thousands of families who were apart for months and years with only paper letters to communicate. To not even be able to tell your loved ones where you are in the world or where you are going during a war. That takes real discipline. So you might be asking yourself, well, that's very interesting, Tad, but how can I use any of this information in my professional life? Great question, listener. The access to sensitive information is also critical in any sourcing or procurement event, meaning when your organization or business decides to go to market and buy something, whether that be software, services, equipment, real estate, you name it. Some sourcing events can be massive in scale and will demand the efforts of dozens of people on both sides of the aisle for months or even years. Not only are millions of dollars in direct and indirect costs at stake, but also the mental well-being of your employees, colleagues, and the vendors you work with on a daily basis should the relationship turn toxic or dysfunctional because of a badly executed contract or vendor selection. While it may not be the life or death situation of the icy Atlantic being prowled by a wolf pack, the stakes can still be incredibly high. Yet, you would be shocked, yes, even horrified, if you knew how much sensitive information is carelessly leaked to vendors with loose lips. While most suppliers really do want to make their customers happy, engaging with vendors has to be done in a smart and disciplined manner, or you risk being taken advantage of in signing a metaphorically torpedoed contract that can cause misery for years and will require a costly exit. So what is this list of prohibited subjects for conversations with vendors and suppliers during a procurement event or a sales negotiation? I've enlisted my good friend Mike Appleton, a 30-year negotiation veteran and all-around good dude, who introduced me to his original list of what not to tell a vendor many years ago. I joined him in his home in St. Paul, Minnesota, to record our conversation, which has been edited for clarity and brevity. Mike, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us, and welcome to Strategy Geek.
Well, thanks for having me, Tad.
Now, Mike, we worked together, and you had a tool, a little one-sheeter, with part of your presentation that you would use every time you kicked off a sourcing event, and it was called What Not to Tell a Vendor.
Yeah, I mean, this works if you're going to buy something off of eBay or if you're part of a multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisition, these same principles apply, and that's what's so important about them.
The other thing I think we should point out, when we say what not to tell a vendor, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily an us versus them kind of conversation, right? This is just good business. This is you being responsible with the organization's resources. Put yourself in the shoes of the salesperson or the people that are on the vendor side of the equation. And they've got to eat, right? I mean, they've got to make the sale, and they want to make some profit, and they want to, send their kids to a good school and have a nice house. And, this isn't an us versus them thing. This is just about being smart. All right, great. So let's hop right in.
Loose lips sink ships. Number 1. Never tell a vendor your budget or reveal any information related to funding.
Yeah, it's amazing how often the vendor's price will be the same as your budget.
Yeah.
Right? It's amazing. And obviously, right? I mean, yeah, if you want to offer the guy, at the candy store $100, for a Kit Kat bar, right? He'll sell it to you for that. Right?
Yeah.
The truth of it is, and this is why I always feel good coming into this conversation with the supplier, is I don't have an unlimited amount of money to spend here, right?
Yeah.
There isn't, they haven't given me the combination to the vault, right? I don't have a blank check here.
Yep.
We've got a limited amount of money. And because the cost of something, it's like buying a boat, right? The cost of a boat isn't the cost of the boat. The cost of the boat includes licensing, finding a place to put it in a slip, the cost of fuel, all those things. And so if you have, $100,000 for something, well, that's $100,000 for everything, not just the cost of the underlying product or service, right? So you have to give yourself some wiggle room or some additional money to pay for all that stuff. That's the equivalent of all those extra things you would get with a boat.
And I'm really glad you brought that kind of total cost of ownership concept up, because many times your stakeholders are not thinking about that. Right. They have a certain amount of money that was allocated for that year or for that budget cycle. And, they aren't thinking about the fact that after you've purchased it and implemented it, there's going to be ongoing support costs. There's going to be enhancements, things that need to happen. And
yeah, I mean, like a really good rule of thumb to use, for example, if you're buying software that's going to be installed and put on the available for network use. I mean, there's the cost of the software, and then there's the cost of the installation, and that installation cost can be anywhere from 10 to 50% of the cost of the software, depending on how complex it is, right? So you've got to allow for that, right? And once again, where are you going to get that extra $50,000 if you've got a $100,000 budget and you just plonked it all down on the cost of the software? Something which in reality doesn't cost anything because, right, it's not like
cost.
Yeah, exactly. It's a sunk cost.
Yeah,
so
for the vendor.
You have to take all those things in consideration, and you also have to let the vendor know that you're thinking about that as part of your overall cost. And by the way, that number can change, right? So I can't give you a solid number for how much we have. How much what are you pricing this as? And then I can start doing my math.
You're doing the buying, and it's incumbent on them to give you the numbers, right?
Absolutely.
And one of the pieces of pushback that I would get sometimes as to why you can't tell them, why? Somebody would ask, why can't I tell them the budget? Because I want to make sure that they're not so far out of our league price wise that we're wasting our time talking to them, right? I'm sure you've heard this one before, right?
Yep.
And I would just remind them that, look, over the course of the RFI and the RFP process, we will slowly be poking at the price question, right? And unraveling that slowly. But by all means, leave that up to your sourcing negotiator. Do not worry about that.
Yeah, and that's a big source of frustration when I've worked with people on projects and we're working on contracts. The very last edit that I ever make to a contract is the price on there.
Yeah.
I mean, that is never settled in my conversation. We're talking about all the other language in there, and I always park the price because something could come up, right, in the course of the negotiations, which would drive the total cost of ownership up, and that would have an impact on what the price of, the software or the maintenance or on something would be.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, good. Have we beaten that one to death?
Twice.
Loose lips sink ships. Number 2. Never disclose the names of current or other suppliers under consideration.
I always say that these guys all drink at the same bar.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of these people, in a particular industry, right? I mean, they change jobs and they work for different companies. And, somebody who worked for Ford, can very easily go work for GM, and they know what the recipe to the secret sauce is. Plus, they still have friends over there, right? And, there is collusion there. There is knowledge of what's going on there. And there's a lot of subterfuge that can go on both sides of the arrangement, the relationship. They can talk to the other people on there. They can collude to get the best deal on there, right?
Yeah.
Or also they can play the other supplier off of themselves to sort of convince stakeholders from your company that they shouldn't use that other company.
Yeah.
One of the best things ever was I had a electric motor salesman, was aware of the fact that we're using a different type of motor. And he planted the seed in one of our executives' heads that the motor company that we were using was going out of business. Okay. Although that was a complete and utter fabrication. But it got up into the ether and was, talked about enough where I had to prove like 4 or 5 different times that motor manufacturer was in fact not going out of business.
And this reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the rule that the amount of effort required to refute bullshit is
yes,
exponentially higher than that required to create it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tool that they'll use, right? I mean, it's a tool that they'll use. They will throw the other supplier underneath the bus with information that's true or otherwise.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'd like to add to this one is, in many cases, whether or not you're aware of it or not, there have already been non-disclosure agreements signed.
Yes.
Between your company and the vendors that you're talking to, and you're actually contractually not allowed to release that information.
Yeah, like how often do you have conversations with other people you work with about how much money you make?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's something you take very careful custody of and not share with other people. Well, other companies don't want you sharing that kind of pricing information with other companies. I mean, they want you to protect that with the same amount of, amnesty, I guess, or
anonymity.
What is it? Anonymity. Yes, correct. Amnesty is a different word.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not only that you shouldn't, but in most cases you're not even allowed to, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's confidential information that the vendor is giving you, and you are not allowed to share that with anyone outside of your sourcing event. Most likely, certainly not with people outside of your own organization.
Correct.
Loose lips sink ships. Number 3. Never disclose how much of a good or a service you might purchase.
Give me an example of this. My brain automatically goes to hardware on this for some reason. Kind of more of a straightforward purchase. But what is this trigger for you, Mike?
It triggers a very specific thing for us. Our corporation was doing an acquisition, and they were buying a certain number of facilities in another country. And we broadcast to all of our suppliers that we were going to need that thing. And I think the initial multiplier was like 400.
Okay.
So we got pricing for 400 of a bunch of different things.
Okay, yeah.
And then that number changed to 300. And then it changed to 200.
Right.
And then I think it went down to like about 150.
Okay, yeah.
Right? So all of a sudden, all these suppliers don't like the fact that I'm trying to get that 400 piece price for the 150 piece price,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think you have to be careful of that because the plan always changes, especially in a big corporation. I mean, and what they need and how many they need is very amorphous. And obviously, the more you learn about something, it's going to change your understanding of what you might need or how many you might need, or like the scale of what you might need, right? You may not need the super deluxe version of it, right? You might just need the base model, right?
Yeah.
And so give yourself a little time to figure that out through, sourcing actions like an RFP or an RFI.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And it's also about setting expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't want to disappoint, right? I mean, because I think it's important to point out that in many cases, you're establishing a long, ongoing relationship with this vendor, right?
Yes.
And you don't want to jack them around.
Correct.
Right? I mean, they're human beings, and they deserve some manner of planfulness and honesty on your part, right?
Yes.
We should probably do a reverse of this, which is like, unethical things that you just shouldn't do with a vendor that has nothing to do with what you say, right? But, you can't lie. You can't fabricate, you need to be.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're a father, right? You have children. Yeah. And if you promise your son you're going to give him an Xbox for their Christmas present, right? And then, when Christmas comes around, you really only came through with a ballpoint pen.
Yeah.
That's a really difficult conversation to have, right? And it's the same with suppliers, right? And so if you give them this idea that they're going to get a lot of money from you, right, and sell you a lot of stuff, they start planning on, buying the BMW for themselves with their commission check, right?
Yeah.
And when it gets down to like a very small percentage of that or something much smaller, I mean, typically these are people that you have business relationships with, and that really doesn't win you any favors in that future business relationship you're going to have with that salesperson or that company.
Yeah, and also remember that depending on what you're purchasing, I mean, there may be supply chain, production implications.
Oh, yes.
I mean, if you give them a number that is just astronomical out there, you don't know it, but potentially behind the scenes, they're hitting up 20 other people.
Yeah, well, even in the professional services area, right? If you give somebody the idea that you're going to, employ 100 of their people as subcontractors, they might like start giving people plane tickets and like looking for places for people to move. And then when you say, "Oh, did I say 100? I just meant 10?"
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really difficult position to put yourself and that salesperson who you need to help you with projects in, right? And you just don't want to do that.
And again, remember, quantity pricing, again, all that stuff is going to be teased out in the RFI, RFP.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And usually the way that kind of gets spelled out is the vendor puts out overinflated prices by quantity, things like that. Right?
Yeah.
And then it gets trimmed down over the course of the negotiation.
Correct.
I think a lot of these probably kind of fit into the category of your client just worrying about money and dollars.
And there's another side of the coin also. You don't want to set expectations too high with your stakeholders within the company, right? Like, hey, I'm this professional negotiator. This is what I do for a living. Don't worry, I'll take care of it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, like, no matter how long I've been doing this, like, I can't go to a Chevy dealership, right, and get a new Corvette for $10,000.
Yeah.
My negotiating skills, nobody's negotiating skills are that good, right? They just won't sell it to you for that, right? Yeah. And so, I think you also have to be careful what you communicate internally about that so you don't set too high an expectation.
Yeah. Good point.
Loose lips sink ships. Number 4. Never tell a vendor how much you love them or that they are the only supplier being considered.
As soon as there's competition in there, whoever you're talking to, whatever question you have for them, their answer is going to be yes. When the competition goes away, everything you answer, every question you ask, the answer is going to be no.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's why, even like, so I don't think you should ever put yourself in a position, if you're ever going to be spending a significant amount of your company's money, that you should be only looking at one supplier, not just to play the two off of one another, to understand what you need to buy, right?
Yeah, yeah. See what's available in the market.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct, right? Because the answer is there's really never only one supplier in the run-in, right?
Yeah.
Because people, like we said before, people change their mind too, right? And things can change. And so I think it's kind of ludicrous just to think that you're only ever going to buy one thing, unless you have a history of buying this one widget, like, to build whatever your product is. But yeah, you should always keep an open mind on there and give opportunity for your company and that company to bid on it and win that business again.
Yeah, because thinking back, it's quite rare that you run into a vendor that is just really disruptive and innovative and all of those buzzwords.
Mm-hmm.
They do exist. I mean, sometimes they show up and they just blow everybody else out of the water, and they're the only game in town.
Yeah, I mean, there's never been a point in my career, right? And I've been doing this for 30 years that where I spend my company's money on something where I don't feel like I have to prove that I didn't do the right thing. I have to show that we got value for money on it and we picked the right thing.
Yeah.
Any situation where you're like single sourcing it, you're going to really have a hard time justifying that you did that, right? That you made the right move. You made the best possible decision, because there was no decision, right?
Yeah.
And if whatever you buy doesn't work, right, or there's some problem, or the company goes out of business because it's Joe's, Acme whatever shack on the corner and they're not able to support it anymore, you bought something that's completely useless, right?
Yeah, and just a little terminology clarification, though, when we say single source.
Yep.
So that just means effectively when you go to market without a competitive event, you go to buy from one supplier, you never really look at any others.
Correct.
And you're generally going to pay a premium in that situation.
Correct. 90% of the time, they have somebody in mind that they want to get it from.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I find that when you're in a competitive situation where you're looking at two different people, right? Two different suppliers, two different vendors, it's a bake-off, right?
Okay.
I would say, I mean, in all honesty, when you do that properly, only 50% of that time does that preferred vendor actually win.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
I mean, I think very statistically, I think that bears out for all the number of projects that I've done that for. And people's eyes really open to somebody that they've never seen before, right? I mean, if all you've ever eaten is apples, how do you know that a banana doesn't taste good, right?
Yeah, there's almost some interesting kind of evolutionary things at play here, right? I mean, on the one hand, most human beings at first blush tend to be very change averse, right? So there might be pushback initially, right, on not single sourcing something because, one, it's going to be a lot of work, right? I'm going to have to change suppliers potentially, right?
Yep.
But if you can just get one or two of the new suppliers in the door, then you activate another evolutionary concept, which is, oh, wow, I think maybe I like the cave person that came in from this faraway tribe. They look different. They've got something different to offer.
Absolutely.
Right? And a lot of the times that takes over.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Loose lips sink ships, number 5. Never agree to an on-site proof of concept or lab.
It's not that that's a bad idea, necessarily.
No.
But because a lot of vendors are going to come in and say, our product is so great. What we'd like to do is take Steve here and put him on site for a couple of weeks, and he's going to implement the product on your systems. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll look at some reports or we'll look at whatever the outcome is, and we'll go from there. How's that sound? What's the problem with that, Mike?
Well, it's kind of like getting a test tattoo, right? Right? It doesn't go away, right? Once it's there, it's embedded like a tick. It's there permanently, and getting it extracted is going to be terrible or painful, like getting a tattoo removed, right? There's other things you can do. There's demos that you can do where you can test a product where it isn't a proof of concept, where it's like installed in your infrastructure, right? It's expensive to get it in there. People, fall in love with it when it's there. Of course, it's the apples and bananas thing, right? I mean, it's great, but nobody's had a chance to compare it to something. So I think there's some pretty elaborate demos you can do, and especially now where like so much stuff is online, right? And you can use this stuff virtually, where you can really get a good idea of how it works and get a look for the feel of something, but then also get the look and feel for something else. So if there's like some big infrastructure commitment and there's like a time and materials commitment by people that work for your company, then it's going to be super hard to get rid of it, right? And then at that point in time, they're going to fall in love with it. They know that you've fallen in love with it, and then there's no way to like get better terms and conditions, right? To get better pricing or anything like that. You're really stuck with it.
You're generally going to see this with software implementations, and the way that you make money in software implementations is not by selling the software.
Correct.
It is by selling services afterwards. It is labor, right?
Correct.
So the tactic that the vendor is trying to use here, you're kind of inviting the Trojan horse into the walls.
Correct. You're going to be paying them 15% maintenance, at least 15% maintenance on this, for eternity, right? And I mean, for upgrades that you might not ever do, right?
Right.
Or bug fixes that no one might think to ever call about.
The other thing I'll point out with proof of concepts is that a lot of the times, even if you do them, they end up being way more complicated than you expected.
Of course.
And a lot of reasons for that being around privacy and data protection. So yeah, it sounds great for a vendor to come in and integrate with one of your systems, bolt on their amazing product, and show you, the oracle of the future. But then you find out, oh, guess what? We're dealing with patient data or, private information of customers or financial information. And then you're stuck in this whole, okay, so now we've got to create dummy data for the vendor. And what does that really mean? Is that, so all of a sudden your real world proof of concept gets a lot less real.
Well, you bring up a really good point, Ted, because there's an element of this also, kind of the drug dealer element to it, right? Because your first taste is free, right? And so this original POC is free. Yeah. And inevitably, it's going to go on much longer than you thought, right? Because like getting data together and get things installed and having security take a look at things and have other people sign off and stuff, this 1 month POC turns into a 6-month POC, right? Oh, and by the way, the only part of that POC that was free was really only the first 30 days, as each subsequent month for that was going to be, $50,000 a month, right? Yeah. And so it's ludicrous to think that you're going to be able to complete this full, thorough evaluation of something within the time frame that they give you, which is the free part of the POC. That basically never happened.
If you are the vendor and your goal is always going to be, as a salesperson, to try and establish deep relationships with as many people as you possibly can at the highest level that you can.
Yes.
But when you have staff working for free, you are giving them an unprecedented amount of access to your organization.
You're leading really next to the next number on the list, right? The next item on the list, right?
Loose lips sink ships, number 6. Never disclose the names or contact information of key decision makers.
There's a thing that suppliers do when they do their big intro meetings, is they want you to bring everybody you can possibly get in the world for them to do their presentation.
Yeah, invite your doc.
Yes, everybody. You bring the vice president. And then one of the things they do is they hand out a sign-up sheet. And on the sign-up sheet, you write your name and you sign your name and what your role is, right, on there, and your contact information.
Yeah, your email and phone number.
Right? Yeah. One of the things that I've done in those meetings, and numerous times. When I see that piece of paper being passed around, I just reach over and I crumple it up right in front of everybody's eyes and I throw it in the wastebasket.
Making friends.
Yep. Yeah. Because this is the thing that gives them the opportunity to make an appeal to somebody that, makes more money than you, has more stripes. You're like, Mike is being a jerk to me, Mr. Vice President. Like, can't we just get this thing done? He's making this draw out way, way, way too long, right? Yeah. And he's got his phone number, he's got his email address. And not only, is he working against you, he's also, basically throwing you under the bus with one of your executives.
One of the reasons that vendors like to go up the food chain is as you get into the C-suite and your alpha executives, and this is nothing against them, but these are doers. These are people who don't like excuses. They like to get things done.
Correct.
If the vendor starts hearing a sense of urgency from you, shortened timelines and urgency always cost more money.
Absolutely.
It's that simple.
An umbrella salesman always increases the price of umbrellas when it's raining. So if the umbrella salesman inside a building without any windows, don't tell him that it's raining, right? You don't want him to raise the price on you, right? And so telling them that you're in a tight spot and you need this stuff right away, if that comes from anybody, that's just a sweet, juicy opportunity that they're going to sink their teeth into, right?
That's right.
And they're going to play that urgency against you.
Loose lips sink ships. Number 7. Never make an informal agreement without negotiating a formal contract.
Well, and I'll just come out and say it. I'll be the bad guy for a moment. Coming to a verbal agreement without anything being in a contract on a golf course, that is not responsible.
Correct.
Right. And I'll say, and I know I'm probably irritating some of my friends who are listening to this.
They like to play golf.
Who like to play golf and do handshake deals on the golf course.
Yeah.
But that's not good business.
There's that vision of those two cigar smoking guys, shaking hands on the golf course. And this is the way that we get things done in America, right?
Yeah.
I've been paid my entire career to look at these things and consider these things and try to help my organization save money and make the right decisions. I'm only trying to help my stakeholders. I'm only trying to help my company. I've got everybody's interest in mind. And so definitely am always out to help people and look at people like they're my customers and make sure that there's some degree of customer satisfaction.
Yeah. Let me just put a little ad for sourcing professionals out there everywhere. Most individuals at a big company or a small company, they will go through a procurement event, every year or two. A sourcing professional is doing 20 or 30 of these things at a time. They've done hundreds of them.
Correct.
Right, over the course of their career. Mm-hmm. And they have seen so much and use them.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tad. And don't look at it as like this box to check, but we also understand the time pressure you're under and your deadlines and your need to get something done. Yeah. And procuring something that makes your boss happy. And there's also all sorts of risks that we're also trying to shield the company from as well, right? And looking at things like, liability and things that aren't part of aren't part of the calculus that somebody has when they're procuring something. Yeah. We're having to wrap all those things in our overall consideration of what we're trying to do. And there's a lot of different interests that need to be served and we're aware of all of them and we'll take care of them. And we're not here to throw anybody under the bus. We're not here to penalize anybody. We're not here to get anybody in trouble. We're working towards the same end as you are. And there's always a tool in the shed to fix a problem. So just let us know and we'll get it done.
Loose lips sink ships. Number 8. Never disclose your current cost structures or contractual details.
What immediately comes to mind on that is a lot of this infrastructure stuff and costs, a lot of times there are big numbers associated with those.
Okay.
Very, very, very big numbers associated with those. And if you start repeating those big numbers, dollar signs come in the eyes of the suppliers you're talking to because look at how much money they have to throw around, right? You know, like, wow, you spent, $100 million to do this, migration. Oh my gosh, that means you've got hundreds of millions of dollars to spend, right?
Right.
And so you're going to find them a lot less, um, malleable or open to negotiating if they think you've got a ton of money. I mean,
Yeah, right.
That's
Yeah.
part of it. And
Yeah.
so I think you've got to be very careful. It's like inviting somebody to your lavish house and you live on a mansion on the hill and, you serve macaroni and cheese, right? Right, that if they think that's all you can afford for a meal, the two don't compute. So I think you've got to keep a little bit of that, like, infrastructure complexity and cost sort of behind the curtain.
Especially anything with high switching costs or...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Again, you most likely aren't allowed to share that information.
Oh, yeah.
That is information that is private between you and the vendor. There are non-disclosure agreements that have already been signed. There's information in the contracts with your current vendors that do not allow you to share that information with other vendors, and you will be under breach of contract.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody's putting stuff in the cloud right now, right? And that's part of that thing. And it's very expensive, right?
Yeah.
And they would not, either one of those organizations would not be happy for you to divulge, like, details about the complexity and the cost and the size of that infrastructure, right? With because either it getting back to one of these two competing, suppliers, Microsoft or Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Or, they don't want you to divulge that to one of these other suppliers either because, they're dealing with other customers that are also putting their stuff up in the cloud, right?
Yeah.
And they don't want you sharing that information because they don't want people to understand what kind of proprietary pricing you've negotiated with them.
So, Mike, one of the things I like to do with each guest is just ask them some fun questions. On things that have absolutely nothing to do with sourcing or business.
Get to look under the hood here.
I'll look under the hood a little bit.
Yeah.
Who is Mike Appleton? Name a historical figure, artist, or great thinker who inspires you.
Teddy Roosevelt is at the very tippy top of my list, right? He's a guy that sort of eschewed convention and came up with new ideas on his own, but not only like had the ideas, but made sure that they happened.
Man of action.
A man of action. One of my favorite stories about Teddy Roosevelt that you may not know is that he was a big admirer of John Paul Jones, the father of the U.S. Navy.
Oh, interesting.
And in, 1901 or whenever he was president, he felt that it was, a bad thing that John Paul Jones was not buried in the United States.
Okay.
So,
because he was buried where?
He was buried in Paris.
Okay.
But they couldn't figure out where he was buried in Paris. And if you know about all the thing about Parisian cemeteries where it was like this huge mucky mess because so many people were buried in these horrible graves in a small area, that where he was buried was actually like they built a house over that cemetery.
Okay.
So, like a guy that gets it done, had someone pay the people who lived in that house to move out so they could excavate underneath there. They found his grave buried underneath this house. They sailed a ship, like a special U.S. naval ship, to bring it over and have him buried at the U.S. Naval Academy, and then paid maybe the best-known sculptor in the United States, a man by the name of Augustus St. Gaudens, to build this huge, memorial for him at the Naval Academy.
Wow.
And have him buried there. And so it was a thing that, he didn't look for consent necessarily to do it, but it wasn't a thing he needed consent for, right? It was the right thing to do. He found this important figure in American history. He made sure that he was honored in the way that he needed to, in the best way possible. And, I think if you look at the Park Service or the Panama Canal or any of those of those things, like the amazing result that came out of just thinking independently and being brave and making decisions, and like what wonderful things those can yield.
Yeah.
So that's why he's a good
Teddy
guy.
Roosevelt. Bully for Teddy.
Bully, yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you for letting yourself be my first guinea pig.
Thank you for having me, Tad.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for our first episode of Strategy Geek. I'd like to thank our guest Mike Appleton once again for giving us his list of topics one should never disclose with vendors, hopefully wrapping up the idea in a historical theme, grounded the subject, and made it a little more fun. We'd love to hear what your thoughts were on the episode. Feel free to email us at stratgeekpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. This is your host, Tad Salyard, saying farewell for now, and in these challenging times, please remember to be kind to one another. Bye.